I remember this story clear as day. It all started with a wedding that seemed like something straight out of a fairy tale. But man, the way it ended, nobody could have predicted. I guess that's life. Things can take a turn in the most unexpected ways. And boy, did this one take a turn. So, my buddy's first wedding, yeah, first because there ended up being more than one, was with this girl I'd also become friends with. Let's call her Katie. Now, Katie was the kind of person you couldn't help but like. She had that whole girl next door charm. Always polite, always kind. But she wasn't just soft, no. She had this fire to her, something I didn't see right away but grew to admire. Despite growing up a little sheltered, she had this fierce determination to live life on her terms. She wasn't about to be told what she could and couldn't do, which I respected the hell out. It wasn't like she was rebellious for the sake of it either. It was more like, I've been playing it safe long enough and now I'm ready to dive in. And that's exactly what she did. And the groom, on the other hand, was a bit of a mixed bag. Let's call him Ryan. I'd known Ryan for years. We met through some nerdy extracurricular competitions between schools. The kind of stuff only a bunch of dorks like us would get excited about. We hit it off over debates about sci-fi, video games, and whatever random trivia crossed our minds. He was the type who could be the life of the party, always cracking jokes and keeping things light. You'd never have a dull moment with him when he was in a good mood. But then there was the other side. Ryan had this tendency to get moody out of nowhere. One minute he'd be laughing, and the next he'd retreat into this sulky, almost brooding silence. It was like flipping a switch. His moods could be unpredictable, but they never lasted long. Usually he'd snap out of it just as fast as he fell into it. That's just how he was. Smart guy. Conversations with him were never boring, especially when we got into the nerdier stuff that only we and a small handful of others cared about. The two of them together? Well, I always thought they made sense and they balanced each other out. Katie's sweetness, her calm but quietly rebellious streak, seemed to complement Ryan's humor and energy. When Ryan was in one of his moods, Katie had a way of pulling him out of it without saying much. It was like she knew exactly when to leave him alone and when to step in, like she could read him better than anyone else. For a while, it seemed like they had it all figured out. So, when they announced their engagement, none of us were surprised. They'd been together for a couple of years by that point, and it just seemed like the natural next step. I still remember the night Ryan told me he was going to propose. We were at this crappy little dive bar, the kind of place with sticky floors and dim lighting that made everyone look a little better after a few drinks. Ryan had a few beers in him already, and he was leaning over the table, grinning like he was sitting on the best secret in the world. "I'm gonna do it, man," he said, tapping his glass against the table for emphasis. "I'm gonna ask Katie to marry." I remember nodding, pretending to be surprised, but I wasn't. You could see it coming from a mile away. They were one of those couples who had that inevitable future vibe. Still, I asked all the right questions. How he was going to do it, when, if he had the ring yet. You know, the usual stuff. Ryan was all fired up, talking about how he wanted it to be perfect, something she'd never forget. And to be fair, he pulled it off. The proposal was straight out of a movie. He did it at this botanical garden they used to visit together. Katie loved flowers, and Ryan had remembered that. He'd gotten her there under the pretense of some kind of casual date, and then, right in the middle of this beautifully manicured rose garden, he got down on one knee. I wasn't there, but I saw the pictures later. The way Katie's face lit up in that moment, it was like everything else in the world disappeared. It was perfect, just like Ryan had wanted. The wedding planning started soon after, and that's when things started to get a little complicated. I guess that's where the cracks started to show, though none of us really saw it at the time. Katie wanted this small, intimate wedding. You know, close friends and family, nothing too extravagant. She was never the type to want anything flashy. But Ryan had a different idea. He wanted something big, huge actually. He was dreaming of this massive celebration. The kind you'd see in a magazine, with hundreds of guests, an open bar, live music. The works. I don't know if it was because Ryan wanted to show off, or if he just liked the idea of a big party. But whatever the reason, it became this point of tension between them. Katie kept trying to scale things down, while Ryan kept pushing for more. And the more they disagreed, the more Ryan's mood swings started to come out. It got to the point where every conversation about the wedding ended in some kind of argument. Usually with Ryan storming off and Katie left standing there, looking frustrated but trying to keep it together. By the time the actual wedding day rolled around, it seemed like they'd managed to compromise. It wasn't the small, quiet ceremony Katie had wanted, but it wasn't the over-the-top spectacle Ryan had been pushing for either. It was somewhere in the middle, a decent-sized wedding at this fancy venue out by the lake. The whole place looked beautiful, with the sun setting over the water and the trees all lit up with these delicate string lights. If you didn't know the backstory, you'd have thought everything was perfect. And for most of the night, it was. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Katie looked stunning in her dress. Ryan looked sharp in his tux. And they both seemed genuinely happy as they exchanged their vows. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. Like they'd worked through all the stuff leading up to the wedding and were starting this new chapter on solid ground. But then came the reception. Man, that's when things really started to unravel. When the wedding finally rolled around, it was a huge deal, but not in the way any of us expected. Ryan and Katie had gone for this very formal religious ceremony that dragged on and on. I mean, it felt like an eternity in that church, sitting in these old, creaky wooden pews, while some ancient priest, who looked like he'd been alive longer than the church itself, just droned on. I tried to stay respectful. It was their day after all. But man, I was fighting to stay awake. Every time I shifted in my seat, the wood would creak, echoing through the near-silent church, and I'd feel the eyes of some distant relative or an old church lady burning into the back of my head. But hey, if this was what they wanted, who was I to complain? After what felt like a small lifetime, the ceremony finally wrapped up, and we headed over to the reception. That's when things started to feel off. Not the place itself. The venue was gorgeous. Big chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, tables covered in crisp white linens, and this massive buffet laid out with every kind of food you could imagine. But there was this weird undercurrent in the air, like something wasn't quite right. It wasn't obvious at first. I mean, Katie was glowing, looking every bit the perfect bride, but there was something in her smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. She was only 20 after all, and barely out of college. Too young to drink legally, which might have been why she seemed a bit more on edge than the rest of us. But it wasn't just her. Ryan really threw me for a loop that night. He wasn't the same guy I'd known for years. Normally he'd be all over the place, cracking jokes, making everyone laugh, especially in a setting like this where the spotlight was on him. But that night, he was cold, distant, almost robotic. He didn't talk much. Not even to the groomsmen, or the friends he'd known since we were all kids. He wasn't rude exactly, just checked out. It was like he was going through the motions, just trying to get through the night. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself it was just wedding jitters, or maybe the stress of the day getting to him. I mean, planning a wedding is no joke, and knowing Ryan, he was probably overthinking every little thing. But as the night went on, it got harder to ignore, even with the alcohol flowing freely. Thank God it wasn't a dry reception. He stayed in this weird, detached zone. Everyone else was having a good time, or at least trying to, but Ryan just wasn't there. He barely touched his drink, which was strange in itself, considering how much he'd been looking forward to the open bar. At one point, I caught up with Katie at the edge of the dance floor, and I tried to gauge how she was feeling. I didn't want to pry, but I made some casual comment like, "You doing okay? Big day, huh?" She smiled and nodded, but again, it didn't reach her eyes. It was like she was somewhere else entirely. I figured maybe they'd both just hit that wall of exhaustion after months of wedding planning, and maybe once they got away for the honeymoon, everything would settle down. That's what I told myself anyway. The night dragged on, with Ryan still acting like a shell of himself, and the vibe just never picked up. People danced, the music played, the drinks kept coming. But there was this weird tension that nobody wanted to acknowledge. When Ryan and Katie finally made their exit, there wasn't the usual fanfare you'd expect. No big send-off, no grand goodbye. They just slipped out quietly, like they were in a hurry to get the night over. I figured that was it. They'd be off on their honeymoon, starting their new life together, and I wouldn't hear from them for a while. I mean, that's how it goes, right? Newlyweds disappear for a bit, wrapped up in their own world. And then they resurface a few weeks later, tan and happy, posting cheesy honeymoon photos all over social media. But this time, not a single post from either of them, no updates, no photos, no texts, just radio silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were taking a break from social media or just enjoying their time. But as weeks turned into months, it started to feel strange. Katie was the type to post about every little thing. Pictures of her cat, sunsets, random moments from her day. Now, dead silence. 6 months passed, and still not a peep. Ryan was the same way. Nothing. I shot him a couple of texts here and there, just casual stuff like, "Hey, how's married life treating you?" Or, "You back from the honeymoon yet?" But I never got a response. It was weird. It wasn't like we were super close. Ryan and I had always been friends, but we weren't the kind of friends who talked every day. But still, 6 months with no word was unusual. I started to get this nagging feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know what. None of our mutual friends had heard from them either. It was like they'd fallen off the face of the earth. Finally, out of the blue, I got a text from Ryan. It was short, almost abrupt, like he was trying to get it over. He didn't answer any of my questions, just said something like, "We're back. Things are fine. Been busy with work." That was it. No details, no mention of the honeymoon. No, "How have you been?" Nothing. I wanted to press him for more, but I could tell he wasn't in the mood to talk, so I let it go, figuring they just needed time to settle back into normal life. But the weirdness didn't stop there. A few weeks after Ryan's text, I ran into one of Katie's friends at a party. I hadn't seen her in a while, and we got to talking about the wedding, about how strange it had been that we hadn't heard from Katie since then. She gave me this look, like she knew something I didn't, and after a little prodding, she finally spilled. "Yeah, they're not doing so great," she said, lowering her voice like she was afraid someone might overhear. "I don't know all the details, but apparently the honeymoon was a disaster. Katie's been staying with her parents for the past few months." That hit me like a ton of bricks. I had no idea things had gotten that bad. The girl I'd seen at the wedding, the one glowing in her white dress, was now holed up at her parents' house, and Ryan, well, who the hell knew where he was? Then, out of the blue, I get a text from Katie. It had been months, maybe closer to a year since the wedding, and I'd figured she'd just moved on, buried herself in whatever life looked like after that mess of a honeymoon. So, when her name popped up on my phone, I was caught off guard. She didn't say much, just asked if we could meet up. I said sure, of course. I mean, after all this silence, I had to know what happened. We met at this little coffee shop, one of those hole-in-the-wall places where the coffee is so strong it'll make your heart race. Katie looked different. She was still the same sweet person I remembered, but there was a hardness to her now, like she'd been through hell and come out the other side. I didn't want to push, so I let her set the pace. We made small talk for a while, about nothing really, until she finally looked at me, sighed, and said, "So, we got divorced." I sat there for a second, not sure how to respond. Divorced? Already? The wedding hadn't even been a year ago. I couldn't believe it. I mean, who gets divorced after 1 month of marriage? It didn't make any sense. But then Katie laid out the whole nightmare, and let me tell you, it was like something out of a bad soap opera. Apparently, the honeymoon, the trip that's supposed to be the happiest time of their lives, had been anything but. She told me how things had been weird from the start. Ryan was still distant, not really engaging, acting like he was just waiting for something. Then, one night, after they finally consummated the marriage, which had been a big deal for her since she'd wanted to wait until they were married, Ryan decides it's the perfect time to drop a bombshell. She said he handed her his phone, just casually handed it over, and then walked off to take a shower like it was no big deal. Katie's confused, thinking maybe he was trying to be sweet or something, sharing photos from the trip. But as she starts scrolling through the messages, it doesn't take long for her stomach to... There it was, plain as day. Text after text from the maid of honor of all people. Turns out, Ryan had been cheating on her for months. Katie's voice shook a little as she told me the next part. Apparently, this whole affair had started because Ryan couldn't wait for marriage. While Katie was holding out, trying to stay true to her beliefs, Ryan had been hooking up with her best friend behind her back. And not just a fling. This was a full-blown... The messages were graphic, explicit, and made it painfully clear that this had been going on for a while. And of all the times to confess, he picked their honeymoon like it was just another piece of casual conversation. I remember sitting there, stunned, as Katie explained how she felt her whole world crumble in that moment. They'd been married for less than a week, and she was already facing the kind of betrayal most people don't deal with in a lifetime. She didn't even wait for him to get out of the shower. She grabbed her stuff, stormed out of the hotel, and caught the first flight back home. That was it. Marriage over. Just like that. They got divorced barely a month after the wedding. She'd filed the papers as soon as she could, and Ryan, to his credit, if you can call it that, didn't fight it. He didn't even try to explain or justify his actions. The guy just let her go, probably too ashamed to face what he'd done. From what I gathered, nobody talks to Ryan anymore. He burned too many bridges with that stunt. Most of our mutual friends cut him off, and as far as I know, he moved out of town not long after the divorce was finalized. I haven't seen or heard from him in years, and honestly, I'm okay with that. The guy's a ghost now, and I don't think anyone's shedding any tears over it. But here's the silver lining. Katie didn't let it break her. Sure, she was wrecked for a while, but she's tough. Tougher than I ever gave her credit for, I'll admit. About a year after the divorce, she met this guy. Let's call him Mark. Total sweetheart. The kind of guy who actually deserves someone like Katie. They hit it off big time, and you could just tell it was different this time. It wasn't some whirlwind romance. It was real, steady, solid. Fast forward 6 years, and they're still happily married. I was lucky enough to get invited to their wedding, and let me tell you, it was hands down the best wedding I've ever been to. And trust me, I'm not a wedding guy. I typically dread them. Long ceremonies, awkward small talk, overpriced drinks, but this one was something else. There was no pretentiousness, no tension, just pure joy. You could feel it in the air. The ceremony itself wasn't one of those drawn-out affairs either. It was short, sweet, and to the point. I think they were up there for maybe 15 minutes, tops. You could tell Katie had learned her lesson from the first wedding. No need for the long, formal stuff. This was about celebrating, not ticking off boxes on some traditional checklist. The reception? An absolute blast. The food was amazing, the drinks were flowing, and the music was perfect. Everybody danced, like actually danced. None of that awkward swaying while you pretend to know the words to a song. It was one of those nights where everyone was just having a great time, and it felt infectious. Katie and Mark, they were all over the place, greeting people, laughing, looking happier than I'd ever seen her. You could tell this was it. This was what she'd been waiting for all along. She finally got her fairy tale, just not the way she'd originally planned. But sometimes, I guess that's just how life works. The path takes you somewhere unexpected, and when you get there, you realize it's exactly where you were supposed to be all along. Now, if I had to rank weddings, Katie's second one would be at the top. No contest. But a close second would have to be my brother's second wedding. Yeah, you read that right. Second. It wasn't because the first marriage went up in flames or anything dramatic like that. Nope, my brother had to get remarried so the Catholic Church would recognize his marriage. The whole thing was about as fun as it sounds. My brother, let's call him Jake, isn't exactly the most religious guy. In fact, I can't recall the last time I saw him voluntarily step foot in a church that wasn't for a wedding or a funeral. But his wife? Oh man, she's deeply Catholic, like born and raised, Sunday service kind of devout. She's a sweetheart, and we all love her, but her faith is a big part of her life, and for her, having the church's blessing on their marriage was a non-negotiable. So Jake, being the good guy that he is, went along with it. Even though the whole thing felt like a massive inconvenience, you could tell he wasn't thrilled about the idea of a second wedding, but he'd do anything to keep her happy. And honestly, that's one of the things I admire. The first wedding, which was more or less secular, had been a blast. It was laid back, full of friends and family, and Jake had that big, goofy grin plastered on his face the entire day. The vibe was easygoing, like everyone was just there to celebrate the two of them without any pressure or expectations. But this second wedding? Completely different story. For starters, it felt forced, like we were all just going through the motions to check off a box for the church. The ceremony itself was in this huge, echoey cathedral, which might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but on that day, it felt stiff. The priest was serious. The readings were long, and there wasn't a single light-hearted moment to be found. I swear it was like the total opposite of Jake's personality. I kept sneaking glances at him during the service, and even though he was trying to play it cool, I could see it in his eyes. He was bored out of his mind. But to his credit, he never complained. He stood up there, said his vows again, and did his part with a straight face. And afterwards, at the reception, he laughed about the whole thing, telling us how it was just one of those things you do for love. He didn't care how many times he had to get married, as long as his wife was happy. You gotta hand it to him. He was a good sport about the whole thing, even if the rest of us were half asleep through the ceremony. Still, as much as we joke about it now, That second wedding ended up being a pretty solid memory. Maybe it wasn't fun in the moment, but looking back, there's something about seeing Jake go through all that for his wife that sticks. It's one of those things that makes you realize what a stand-up guy he is, how he's willing to bend a little for the people he loves. Anyway, as for Katie, after all the chaos with her first wedding, she finally got her happy ending. And honestly, she deserved it. Life has this weird way of balancing things out, I guess. It's like you have to go through the worst to find the best sometimes. And if anyone's proof of that, it's her. She came out stronger, smarter, and with a guy who truly values her. But man, that first wedding? It's one I'll never forget. For all the wrong reasons. There's just something about watching a perfectly good day unravel that sticks. When I think back on it, I can still see the awkward smiles, the tension that nobody wanted to talk about, and the way Ryan was just checked out, like he was already halfway out the door before the vows were even done. It was surreal, really. None of us had any idea just how bad things were about to get, but looking back, the signs were all there. I think what made it worse was that we all had such high hopes for them. Ryan and Katie seemed like they were made for each other, and maybe in some ways they were. Then again, you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. People can put on a good show for a while, but the truth always has a way of coming out, doesn't it? Even now, I sometimes wonder what happened to Ryan. After the divorce, he pretty much vanished. I heard through the grapevine that he moved out of town, maybe to start fresh somewhere nobody knew him. And honestly, I don't blame him. After pulling a stunt like that, burning bridges with everyone who cared about him, I'm not sure there was any place left for him here. As for Katie, well, she's thriving. Last time I saw her, she was still with Mark, the guy she met after the divorce, and they were as solid as ever. Their life together just seems easy. No drama, no secrets, just a good, healthy relationship. It's funny, really. You'd think going through something like she did would make her more guarded, but instead, it made her more sure of herself. She knows what she wants now, and she's not afraid to go after. I guess that's the lesson in all of this, if there is one. Sometimes, you have to go through hell to figure out what really matters. And when you come out the other side, you're stronger. That's how it was for Katie anyway. Her first marriage may have been a disaster, but it paved the way for something better. It's like life has a way of course-correcting, even when it feels like everything's falling apart. And me? Well, I'm just glad I got to witness it all, for better or worse. Weddings, divorces, second weddings, it's all part of the ride. And while not all of it was pretty, it sure as hell made for some stories I'll never forget.